Welcome to the Impulse Spotlight, a podcast for product development professionals. In this episode, we meet with the Vice President of Product Development for 360 Electrical. Prior to joining 360 Electrical, our guest worked for several companies developing consumer electronics. Jonathan Hsieh, whose parents immigrated from China and Taiwan, was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. After graduating with a degree in Quantitative Economics from UC Irvine, he had the opportunity to start developing consumer electronics and hasn't looked back. In his spare time, he loves to read books and listen to podcasts pertaining to mindset. In our discussion, Jonathan provides an in-depth look at what it takes to develop phone cases. From chasing down phone data to extremely compressed timelines, Jonathan walks us through the fast-paced world of developing phone cases. Outside of the design process, he offers some great wisdom around using rest and recovery to perform our best, and some things to be mindful of when selecting vendors. Join us as we gain a better understanding of what goes into designing and manufacturing phone cases. Let's get into it. Hey, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Trey, thanks for having me.
Sure. So I always start out, I tell everybody that I kind of saw the writing. I started Impulse 26 years ago, kind of saw the writing on the wall of the company I was working for. They had all facets of product development under one roof. And, I tell everybody I got my master's degree working there in product development. That's how I kind of learned product development and got into it. So tell us how you got into product development.
So I actually graduated college in 2010, and it was really weird because I majored in quant econ accounting. And I was going to go into real estate development, but there was an internship lineup for that route, but it wasn't a paid job. So I elected to go another route, which is product management, product development in memory drives. And so that's how I actually just started. It was 2 weeks right out of college. I just wanted to work and gain some real world experience. So kind of dabbled around, and then 15 years later, I'm still in the consumer electronic space.
Crazy. Yeah, that's interesting. Real estate to consumer products.
Yeah.
So what's your current role?
Yeah,
what kind of product do you develop?
So currently, I work for a company called 360 Electrical. They're based in Utah, and they sell things like surge protector, extension cords, charging products for your mobile accessories. My role with the company is VP of Product Development.
All right. And tell us about the product. Is there a product specifically that you want to talk about today?
So the product I actually want to talk about is actually from my previous job, which is mobile accessory phone cases. It's a really interesting type of product. It's a really fast-paced industry, and you can get really old and grow a lot of white hair because of that.
Yeah, I'm interested to learn about it.
Yeah.
So kick us off with this. Tell us some of the highlights of developing a product like that.
So mobile accessories, I think we got to start with sort of the high level, which is calendar based. So mobile is really driven by, so every year there's actually device launches. So Apple's going to launch their new devices soon. You got Samsung, you got Google, and every time there's a new device launches, and you also have iPad and AirPods, you have to keep up. And so what we do is, in the past is, we would have to get the data ahead of time. And you do that through third-party sources, through the factory. And then we have to open tools, open molds, and have sample, develop, test, ship product before launch. And so usually our customer will want it right before the announcement. So it's a really tricky, product to develop because of the timeline compression. But there are tricks around it. Once you have templates of what that looks like, the design, it can get pretty easy to work out. So
that's really interesting. So you said you get the data from third party. Is, for lack of a better term, do you have to steal the data to develop the cases, or how does that work?
No, so for example, iPhone, the factories, they have connections with sub suppliers of
Okay.
Apple, and that's how they get their data. And for us, we would work with them to, hey, do you have any data? And usually factories are pretty open to share because they want the business. And so we'll kind of triangulate. We'll get data from this factory, and this factory, and we'll kind of like triangulate and see, hey, does the button line up? Are the ports lining up? All these little details. And then we kind of hold on until the timeline is right to really need a kickoff tool, just to make a launch. So, usually you're opening mold with a high degree of uncertainty and risk. And so think about making that product and realizing, all your inventory is wrong and you've shipped to the customer. And then how do you clean up after that? So the tricky part with that is you're not going to get the device ahead of time. So you're not going to get the phone, and you're not going to test fit. And so what we usually do is we'll actually create a steel dummy and we'll test it with the phone cases. We'll test the button, we'll test the port, and the fit. And you just have to work with it. So that's really one aspect of dealing with kind of like the Apple. And then you have other partners like Samsung and Google, where you'll actually be invited to their headquarters or to their places in Korea, and you can actually see the device in person, but you can't bring any, your own personal camera in to take photos. So, back in the days, one of us developer will be elected to take, we'll go in and then we'll have to represent our other coworkers, our other developers. So we have to take on their projects too, as we go in with a bunch of phone cases, and then we're sitting there with a note and we're writing down, oh, you got to move this button by 0.5 millimeter. So, and then you have to go out and just say,
you can go in and test fit, but you can't take any measurements. You can't do anything.
You can bring in like calibers, rulers, but you can't take photos. And so you really have to go off of memories. You go off of your notes, but that's what they call it. So Samsung calls it the clean room. You go in there and then you have to just basically test fit. But even before that, we actually sent we will send designers or engineers actually to Samsung, and then they actually go into the room where they actually have to like redraw the CAD. So what they do is you'll have the actual device, and then they have to draw like a basic phone case around it. And then they'll take that phone case, Samsung will review the data and then send it back to us. And then from there, we kind of have to like reverse engineer what the device shape is going to look like. And so you really have to rely on your coworkers to get the details right. And then we'll take that and then we'll draw our own different design cases, and then we'll open the tool. And then once we open the tool, we'll have samples. And then we take a bag of samples and we'll go into Korea just to test fit. So that's one example where it's like really tricky. You're not going to have devices ahead of time, or you may have devices, but you have limited access to it. And then there are other times where like the carriers like AT&T, Verizon, they'll just give you a device, and then you just have to be very careful about not sharing it. And that makes, life much more easier when
How soon before the actual release do you get like final data? I mean, have you ever gotten to where you've built a tool and then they decided, oh, we're going to move a button to a completely different area?
Generally, it's been pretty safe, because the way you think about it is Apple has to pretty much lock down their data and not make any last minute changes. So they're months ahead. They have to lock down the BOM, the design, and then actually mass produce. So for them to change a last minute is a pretty significant change. And then I think that also impacts their compliance process, where they may have to redo certain things. So for us, usually the cadence is like Apple, let's say, will make the announcement late September. And then so for us, we'll probably open tool probably in June or July. And then we'll do the sampling and we'll ship production by like early August. So it's a really compressed timeline. And usually what happens is a lot of us will get sent to China, and we'll be there from tool kickoff till sample and then pre-production. So it can be like 4 to 6 weeks. We're just sitting there camping at the factory and just reviewing samples and getting things out and just like, being on the engineers. Yeah.
That's crazy. So, walk us through you've talked about getting the data, and then you've talked about tools. Like, can you walk us through the whole process of what it's like to, design, develop the entire product?
Yeah. So basically you have sort of the concept, the ideation. That's where, your designer comes in, they'll design. And then once you have your design, we'll work on a preliminary CAD. And preliminary CAD is usually what the designer kind of wants to model after. And then you're going to send that CAD to the factory and actually have the factory's engineer redraw the CAD because you want the CAD to be toolable. So they're going to redraw the CAD in a certain way where, it's toolable. You can pull out a tool. There's not going to be issues. And in that process, there's usually a lot of back and forth between, the engineers and the factory because the engineer wants it a certain way or the designer wants it a certain way. But the factory is like, hey, no, you can't do this because of this issue. So there's a lot of tug and pull there. And what I try to do is try to accommodate the designer, maybe like 30% of the way. But I'm more practical and I think about production risk and production timeline issues. And so we want to really listen more to the factory as long as the reason they give is very logical. And it makes sense. And then so once we have, the engineer CAD done, we'll actually build a prototype. So that could be SLA, it could be 3D print. But the whole idea behind it is to really see the fitting and then also what it looks like visually. And then once we have that done, everybody likes a prototype. We're just going to kick off tool. And then when you kick off tool, that's usually depending on, the construction of the phone cases. Let's say it's a single shot plastic, or it can be an overmold. So like a plastic and a TPU together, or there's other materials involved or more complicated process that could prolong the tooling time and the sampling time. But generally, like in a month, you can have, from tool kickoff to actually like T0 samples, which is trial zero samples in about a month. So once we have tooling done, then you have samples. And so samples is really, you'll get the initial, first shot injection, and then, you'll review, you'll test fit. And then once we test fit everything, like the ports all line up, it's not loose, it's pretty tight, it's easy to put on. It doesn't crack, all the quality issues. Then we'll go on and kind of do the final touches, which is like the surface finish, the paint, the cosmetics, applying materials. So you do that kind of more in the later stages. But in the beginning, you're really kind of making sure, hey, does it fit? Does everything line up? Are there any other kind of basic issues before we go in and really polish the tool, we texture the tool? And so that's really the sampling stage, sample everything, you get the colors out, and then you do testing, do some basic testing. That could be like drop testing, alcohol rubbing, things of that nature. And then you also work on packaging. And then after packaging, you just have to drive. Well, so with packaging, you're actually coordinating with a lot of in-house team because they have to do copies, they have to do legal, they have to create the content, they have to do the artwork. And so a lot of times you really have to make sure, when they give you the artwork, you're really reviewing and making sure all the details are correct. Because I've seen a lot of times, even I've done it myself, where I just really see artwork and realize, oh crap, something wrong with that. And in the factory sampled with 2 weeks, sent it to you, and you realize, oh, that was wrong. And so it does help to check other people's work. And then, but yeah, once packaging is done, you really see artwork. You have samples of that. You put it together with your phone cases. You define the BOM, and then you just go production. And then before we go production, there's also a planning aspect of it. We look at capacity. So do we need to create more tools to meet the launch date? Or I think the other thing is, uh, yeah, the brain fart. Sorry. But yeah,
Right.
we look at it's a pre-production planning. So tooling capacity is one of them. And then the other aspect is material preparation. So sometimes the phone cases that I usually deal with have leather on it. And so leather generally has its own lead time, especially if you're sourcing it from like Italy or Korea. And I've had to do that because, back in the days, we partner with Coach. And so a lot of the materials came from Korea, came from Europe, and so we've had to order these materials ahead of time. And so typically it takes like 2 months, 2 to 3 months, 2 months to
Wow.
make, and then a month to ship it to the factory. And so you really have to make sure you're not only doing development, but you're actually kind of preparing the materials ahead of time. And so
Sure.
you're kind of lining up the production at the end.
Wow, that's really interesting. Were the cases that
Yeah.
you helped design the kind that just kind of snap over the phone, so to speak, that just kind of bend and you get them, or were they like two-piece clamshell?
There's different form factors. We've done like that snap one piece plastic,
Okay.
but the industry really geared toward more protection. And so with protection, you either work with like more softer materials like TPU. It's like a
Hmm.
rigid plastic, but it's flexible. It can be a
Hmm.
one piece, but we've done a lot of where it's a combination of PC, polycarbonate, and TPU kind of over molded together or as a separate piece and you put it together. Um, I've actually done a lot of cases where it's like a plastic, but you have recess and we call it inlay. And we'll like put leather or PU and we'll apply the or fabric and we inlay it into the recess. And so you really
Okay.
get that fashionable touch. Um, and then there are cases where we do like techniques called IML in mold lamination. This is where you take like a PET and you print like fashion prints, and then
Okay.
you can do crazy things like glitter and foil, really high end finishes. And then you take that PET and you kind of form it into that shape of the device or the phone cases. And then you put that PET into the tool of the other tool where there's already, where you inject the overall plastic of the phone case. And so it's
Hmm.
bonded together.
Oh
And
wow.
then you come out with this really girly design. So that's something that I actually worked on in my other job where we did a lot of licensing work. And so we worked with brands like Coach and Kate Spade New York. And what was really interesting about that was um, there was an evolution in that period. I think it was around 2014, where they call it like fashion meets technology, fashion meets tech, where there's more, now you're bringing more of the fashionable aspect, where it's the materials, where it's the print, and then now you're applying it onto your phone cases. So it doesn't look really plain. And so really seeing the evolution of phone cases go from something that's just plain and something protective to something that's very fashionable and something it's a statement about you.
Very interesting. Um, when
Yeah.
it comes to the phone cases that are, well, somewhat TPU, I guess, that just kind of snap over a phone, are those molded just open and shut, or do they have like collapsible cores? And how do they get them out of the mold?
How do they get out? So the way to get it's you I usually there's a way where it's like there's an ejector, it kind of pushes out. So it depends
Hmm.
on the construction of the tool and the way the factory or the factory engineer designs the tool. But usually I've seen it where it's either just pushed out or
Okay.
it's done in a way they have to kind of just pull it.
They peel it off. Okay.
They peel it
Interesting.
off, yeah.
Yeah. But I assume it's multi-cavity tools all the time.
Exactly. I think so it depends. So if if you have if it's like a single shot plastic type of case, I would probably go more cavity because it's probably safer. But when you have multiple components, let's say a plastic and then a PC and a TPU, and you're
Hmm.
fitting together, I generally would try to keep the tooling counts low, meaning the cavity low, because think of you have two cavities for PC and two cavities for TPU, and you have to mix and match. And so
Mm,
not every cavity is 100% the same. And so
sure.
if you open, let's say, a cavity is a PC, a cavity is TPU, you're going to have a nightmare trying to fit everything. And then you're going to realize during production that this came from cavity 3, but it doesn't fit this. So for consistency, if you have more complicated or more parts to the cases, keep the cavity count low. So it's more easier to modify and keep the size in control.
Yeah. So you'd rather 8 tools than 8 cavities.
Exactly.
It's
But
interesting.
it's not to say that you can scale up. So you can scale up, let's say, two PC, two TPU in that kind of setup. But to do
Mhm.
like a PC and a TPU cavity, that's something I don't recommend.
Yeah.
You're
That's
gonna have a
interesting.
lot of headaches.
Sure.
Yeah.
So with all the products Impulse helped design, there's always a challenge, and you've talked about plenty of them already. But what's the biggest challenge
Yeah.
that you face when you're developing products like this?
I think the biggest challenge, there's a couple, but I would say one of the challenge, and I think it's more of kind of on the selling side, is really the call it call it fee. So when we before we kick off tool, we'll usually go into kind of feasibility
Hmm.
review, and you're actually looking at compliance, you're looking at costs, you're looking at, is this toolable, you're looking at, is there going to be issues with the process. Um, so one issues that I think is really important for everybody to kind of really consider is, do you have a customer for this product?
Hmm.
Do you have an existing base of customer that you have a home for it? What I've noticed in the past with a lot of companies, they're just going to build it and think that either their existing customer or there's magically going to be a customer that's going to take on this product. Um, and so you really have to audit your existing customer base and say, hey, is there a probability they're going to take it? You also have to kind of look at your sales team and are you confident in them selling that product? What you don't want to do is just, not have a business case and kick off a project, spend 10, 15 grand on tool, and then realize that no one's going to take it. And then once you commit to that inventory, you're tying up capital, and then you're fluffing up the balance sheet. So that's something that I would say is a challenge, is to really consider the part about, do you have a home for that product before you really commit to it? And a lot of us, I think, get really excited about the product and positive and say, hey, I think we can sell it. We feel good about it. Um, but man, get your sales team involved, get your marketing team involved early on, audit your customer and make sure you have a home for it. That's probably one piece of advice I would share with everybody.
Yeah, that's
And
really interesting.
then
No, go ahead. Keep
the
going.
other, oh, sorry. The other thing I would share is really, and I think everybody can relate to, is just this tug and pull with your designers and your engineers. Um, and I'm sure you kind of experienced that, where engineers think, no, it has to be this way, or designer, no, I want it this way. And then you're kind of stuck in between with the factory and your kind of design team. And so usually my kind of principle or the way that I operate is, I'll try to accommodate my designer or engineer to a certain point. But if the factory is coming back with really strong facts or sensible, or it just makes sense that you just can't do it, I'm going to present it to the engineers and just make sure, hey, or engineer designer, hey, this is what we're seeing, you know, this is the risk. Are you okay with it? Sometimes
Hmm.
you just have to put the responsibility on them and say, hey, if something goes wrong, I want to make sure you're
Right.
responsible. So that usually gets them to think, hey, maybe I need to compromise a little on the design. And then the other aspect of working with designers and engineer is sometimes they can delay the project, or they do these like last minute changes without really considering the consequences. Like, you'll be making arrangements with the factory, you'll be steps ahead, but they want to make some last minute changes where they want to add something to the samples, and then you kind of have to throw away all your arrangements. So what I would do typically in that case is just tell the be respectful and just tell your team like, hey, when you do this, is actually not convenient, and this is how you impact the timeline, and this is how you impact the rest of the team. So you really have to shine a light, like, this is your behavior, and this is how it affects everybody else, not just me. And so usually shining a light on that kind of makes them um, more agreeable, more cooperative to work with. Otherwise, they're really stubborn and stuck in their ways. So I
Sure.
would say that's kind of like the challenges of development, where you kind of have this back and forth dance with, your designers and your engineers. And so, you just have to shine a light on them and say, hey, there's consequences to changes. And are you okay with that? And how does that impact everybody else?
Sure, sure. Yeah, we're kind of in the middle of both. We'll get direction from a designer, and then what we design goes to a tool maker, right? So the tool maker pushes back, and the designer's pushing back, and yeah, it's kind of like we're juggling, like, how do we make everybody happy? And sometimes you can't. Somebody's got to compromise. So it's just the nature of the. So we've been talking,
especially when it's like very tech. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Especially when it's like very technical, like, oh, you can't tool because this is something wrong with the tool. You can't texture.
Yeah.
Like that when it gets really technical and you have to translate in Chinese to English, that's when I go like, all right, we're just jump on a call.
Yeah.
We're gonna jump on a call. I'm gonna do my best to translate, but I want the designer to be on the call in real time to ask the questions. And usually when they're on the call, they usually are more easier to kind of work with, versus when you have to kind of translate it and then talk to them and send the factory feedback to them, because they can get pretty stubborn or resistant to the feedback, because they don't understand.
Yeah, face to face, it's a big deal. It reminds me of a story. This has been, wow, maybe 20 years ago. I was working for doing a project for a juvenile products company, and they had the tooling people come in to their office in Chicago, and I sat down with a guy. I know no Chinese, and I sat down with a guy. He knows no English, and we basically pointed and drew, and for half an hour, worked out this issue of how something needed to be changed, and like speaking no words, and got it resolved. And
just drawing.
Drawing and pointing and yes and no, and it was really interesting.
That's really cool. I've never heard of that before, so that's really kudos to you.
It was the people around us were like, really, you got it solved? Yeah, we got it done. I think we're good. So yeah,
that's actually like one important thing I look for when you're kind of sitting down with the factory. Like, I get the opportunity to actually travel abroad to actually sit down with the factories, the engineers, and then their quality team. And that's where you really have to like just ask some questions and really, there's a couple of filters that I do, where one, you kind of say, you ask certain things about development, but you really want to listen to kind of their way of thinking. The other thing is like, what vocabulary do they use? Sometimes when they talk about things, certain engineers will be very like pessimistic, very limiting belief, like, you can't do this, you can't do that. So you have to pay attention to the language that they use. And then the other thing I would say is like, kind of see how they interact, like the sales window and the engineers and then the quality team, because the people that arranges your project, your contact window, you want to make sure they have a basic level of respect that they command at the with their team. Because what I've noticed is, if that person isn't well respected because of certain behavior, or because they're poor communicators or whatnot, that will actually create delays in the project, because the engineers or the people that work with them won't probably support them all the way, or they won't prioritize them. And so what that ends up happening is your project gets delayed because of the resistance. So that's something that, when you sit down with the factory, you really have to vet them out. It's like a setting, configuring your setting in when you're playing a game. You want to make sure you pick the right team. And
Sure.
so
Yeah.
those are, a couple tidbits that I would share with the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really good. Um, we've been
Yeah.
talking in generalities about, phone case design. So normally I ask this about a specific product, but if you could go back in time and change one thing about developing the product, it being phone cases in general, I guess, what would it be?
Wow. I think that's a hard question, but like knowing what I know today, you can go back, you're like, oh, I can make a lot of money doing this and that. Um, let's see. Knowing what I know today, yeah, that's a question I have to I have to think about. Um, I think you really have to you're talking about like more design specific, right? Where it's more of a general type of question.
Hmm. Yeah, just it's always interesting, once you get through the process,
Yeah.
get to the finish line, you always look back and go, oh man, if we could have done that differently, or made this decision differently, it would have had a huge impact. Um, is there anything like that you can think of, being
Oh,
somewhat removed of it now?
yeah. So kind of going back to what I was talking about. So at my last job, like we did a lot of projects. We didn't look at the business case. We liked the design. We just open tool. And um, what part of the company culture was kind of like you took on your own projects. Like the directors or people above you kind of just let you do your own thing. They weren't aware of how many projects you had to run or how to
Mm,
oversee. And so for me, it became like a whack-a-mole. Like you're constantly getting things off your plate. It's hard to delegate because you just have so much on your mind. Your headspace is like so occupied. You have all these moving pieces. And so going back, then one major thing I would change is being more selective with projects, pushing back and saying, no, this doesn't make sense. Is there a business case behind it? Um, and being selective. I think because you have sales, you have internal teams, you have designer, you even have the CEO wanting to kick off a project without realizing that adds to your plate. And so when you add to your plate and that plate fills up, that's going to take away from something else, your attention, your energy. And so the one thing I would say is just being more selective and I wouldn't say pushing back, but more of like, hey, can we get more justification on, is this a valid business case to spend the money and the resource and time and effort
sure.
versus like doing 200, 300 projects all at the same time. And then you're just like burning resources. And
Right.
I think
Right.
that was sort of my last company where it just got really crazy. And eventually, financially, the company got into trouble, both inventory wise and then it got taken over by the banks. So that's a consequences of spreading yourself
Sure.
too thin. And so
Yeah.
I would say go back and be selective, understand the business case, and then kind of also making sure this home is a customer for it. Um, Speaking up, I think most importantly, you got to speak up. The people that wants to kick off the project, speak up and say, "Hey, I don't think this makes sense, and here's why." But be afraid to be wrong. I don't be afraid to be wrong. I think that's the thing. Have a a good discussion about it. And so if they feel strongly about it, I would say, support them, but at least call it out. So
No, that's good stuff. Yeah.
yeah.
So switching gears just a little bit as we start to wrap up.
Yeah.
In This is probably my favorite question that I ask because everybody comes at it from a different perspective. What are some of the trends
Yeah.
that you see emerging in the product development world?
Mm, I think in the product development world, everything is so accessible now. What I mean by now is that you have so much competition out there. There's so much design out there. You really have to be on top of your game. I know this is like a very generic kind of statement, but you can go on Amazon and really see pretty cool designs. You have factories selling directly on Amazon. So I would say, the trend used to be where you have kind of like, you know, brands in US, and then they will work with factories, and then they'll bring the product to the market. But now what you're seeing is factory trying to sell directly B2C via Amazon or some platform to the consumer. And so not only do you have competition from brand to brand, but you also have competition from now the factory. So I would say it's this trend of just factory can't make enough business selling just to a customer. They actually have to open up channels to B2C basically. And so you just gonna just a lot of competition, a lot of cheap cases, a lot of cheaper things, and you just have to bring your A game.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I've seen that everywhere. I mean, it's rampant right
Yeah.
now. Um,
Rampant, and your margins are shrinking.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's harder. It's a harder business model to do because you have a lot of capital to spend on tooling and compliance, third party testing, and then the margins are shrinking because of competition, and you have to run ads, or you have you're in retailers and you have marketing fees and programs to pay them.
hmm
So so basically, reducing margin, high capital costs potentially that ties up your capital, and then you have to deal with a lot of inventory. And so if
yeah,
you're not planning carefully, that inventory can really ruin the company. So
sure,
it's a hard business model to be in, especially these days.
yeah.
Yeah.
Reflecting on all the challenges and successes you've had while developing products, what words of wisdom would you share with someone looking to make a significant impact in the product development industry?
Oh, um, I think the biggest word of wisdom I would say, there's a couple, but the first one I would say is you really have to schedule your rest so prioritize your rest and recovery. And what I mean by that is you have to schedule a time for yourself to really go work out or go rest. Don't do anything else, because in the product development world, that motor is constantly on especially when you're dealing with Asia and there's a time difference. And so, this is a marathon, and you really have to keep your energy up, and you want to show up with energy, and you want to show up with a good mind. And so the way to do that, you really have to prioritize your rest and your recovery. um I made the mistake of back in the days, just not the mistake, but I was just working hard. You get in office 8, 9 in the morning, and then you're constantly working till 8, 7, 8, 9. You're eating late dinners, and then you're sleeping at 12 and 1 in the morning because of the time difference. And you keep doing this, and then as a result, you put on some weight, grow a lot of pimples. Um, you just feel unhealthy. And the awakening for me was when COVID started to happen. I actually got COVID, and it was like the first wave. There was um, no remedy for that, and so I was in a hospital for 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And there was a point where I was like, "Hey, I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna make it because I can't breathe." My I coughed so much that I couldn't even expand my lungs, and because
Oh,
I
wow.
was, couldn't get enough oxygen into my body, my like nails were all purple. And
hmm
so COVID is real. And so, while in bed, I was like, that wasn't a good idea to work hard all those years, because you're working hard for a company, but for what? And so I remember sitting there, I was like, well, I just need to start handing things off to my sister. I was getting, preparing a list of like my passwords and where things are at. And I was going to just text it and hand it off to my sister, because I didn't know if I'm going to survive the next few days or not. And so that experience really made me kind of reflect and say, in the product development world, you're constantly going. And
Hmm.
so you want to make sure this is a marathon. And to do that and to survive and to have energy and show up, you know, set time for yourself to just rest and recover, you know. And so that would be like a piece of wisdom I would share with other people.
Yeah,
And then
that's really good.
there's actually one more I think will be really valuable. And this was a discussion that I had with my designer in my current company. He's a really humble, loving guy. And we talked about a lot of times at work, we can get into these negative mindset. And this negative mindset is more about we start to care a little bit too much about what others think of us.
Hmm.
And when we do that, that starts to impact our work, the quality of our work, the way we communicate, our confidence, everything. And so you have to kind of reframe that kind of mindset. And instead of, thinking about, is this person thinking negatively of me? You have to kind of say, hey, what can I do for the team? How can I serve the team? And so that shift in energy, like that shift in mindset shifts your energy, and your attention is not more outer directed. You're more focused on the outside instead of
Hmm.
internally. And so what that allows you to actually do is now be more comfortable and more confident, and you start to work better with the team, and you actually put out more quality work. So, to summarize, yeah, we want to care to a certain point about what others think, but really it's not as productive when you versus if you just say, hey, what can I do to help the team and serve the team? And when you have that kind of mindset behind your work, it can lead to really good results.
Yeah. Yeah. No, those are
Yeah.
both really good. I can definitely relate to the first one.
Yeah.
Especially when I was younger. I mean, 60, 70, 80 hours a week all the time.
It's
Just,
crazy, huh?
yeah. It doesn't take long to learn, though. Like you said,
Yeah.
one little bout with something, and you're like, something's got to change here. So
Yeah,
awesome. This
exactly.
has been great. Before we finish, is there anything else you want to mention with regards to products, the products you're talking about, or product development in general?
Um, I was actually thinking about like kind of wisdom to share. There's actually one more I would share with,
Okay.
with whoever's listening. Like it kind of goes back, I think I mentioned earlier, like review, the artwork, review the CAD, review whatever your team has sent you, because a lot of times what happens is you'll send an art file out. Let's say you send an AVI file, and then the factory comes back to you the next day and say, we can't open it, it's missing something. You just lost a day there. And
Hmm.
in product development, time to market is really key. And so the more days you are sitting developing, the more money and resources you're burning up. And so, these little mistakes do add up. And so what I've noticed with artwork is, you know, designer kind of messing up the Pantone color callouts, or they're missing a call out, or there's layers of this missing in the artwork file. And so what I usually do is release it to the factory, tell the factory to review it right away, first thing in the morning. And then if they have trouble issuing opening the file, or if they see something off, let me know right away. And then I'm usually like texting the designer engineer, like, get this fixed right now. And so that's usually like the piece of advice I would give is like release the artwork quickly in the morning. Have your factory open it up first thing in the morning, make sure everything makes sense. the Pantone, they can find the Pantone color, the artwork file opens up properly. It's not missing any embedded layers or whatever. And then
Hmm.
if not, hold your team accountable, get that artwork to them that same day or that same night, because kind of going back, time to market is key. So
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that the company that I worked for before I started Impulse, their whole thing was time to
Yeah.
market. And I don't know if maybe I just don't pay as much attention or things have changed. Like, it's almost like companies don't value that time they could save.
Yeah.
They don't analyze that and go, oh, if we get that product to market even faster, that's actually more money we're making and less money we're spending. But it's interesting.
Exactly. And I would add to that actually. So, one of the practices I did with my company was like, even before it's like in production, you want to start pre-selling the product. And what that does is going to bring more cash flow closer. A lot of times what I notice with company, even with like my current job, is they'll finish a product, they'll make production, and then once product land, they'll start promoting. And
Hmm.
so, kind of going back to, I think, like in the real estate world, they'll build an apartment, but before they complete it, they already start pre-selling, those rooms. And so you want to do that, you want to embed that into your practice. And so, that's going to allow you to kind of get more cash flow up front, because just know that you're going to sit on capital and burn that capital for a period of time before you can really have product that you can sell. And so the best way to mitigate that is, once you have a really good samples, start promoting the heck out of it.
Yeah.
Show your customers, send it out to customers, put it online, and then in the meantime, plan out the rest of your development and your production, and so you can have a launch date ready in mind. So, pre-sell, I would say that's a really good advice for everybody.
Yeah.
Pre-sell. Yeah.
That is really good advice. So awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you doing this, Jonathan.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
To learn more about Impulse and how we might be able to help you, visit impulseproductdevelopment.com.